All right. So, I'm really fascinated by the auto industry and, global trade and all that. And the articles you sent over, they're pretty wild. Like, we're talking about a major power shift happening right now, and Canada is right in the middle of it.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of an unexpected turn of events.
Hmm.
Canada's making some strategic moves in the EV market, forging some pretty interesting international alliances along the way.
Okay, so help me unpack this a little bit, because it all seems to have started with that trade war back in 2025, when the U.S. put that 25% tariff on all those Canadian imports, like even cars and maple syrup.
Yeah, it really shook things up.
Yeah.
You have to remember that like 75% of all of Canada's exports usually go straight to the U.S. So this wasn't just like a minor inconvenience. It forced them to really rethink their entire economic strategy.
And that's where this whole pivot to East comes in, right? Specifically with Japan.
Hmm.
So, like, what's the backstory there? Why Japan, of all places?
Well, Japan's been looking to diversify their own supply chains for a while, especially when it comes to EV batteries. They have amazing technological expertise, but they rely pretty heavily on China for all the raw materials. And Canada, on the other hand, well, they have those materials in abundance, like nickel, lithium, cobalt, all this stuff you need.
So it's like a perfect match, almost like a geopolitical dating app brought them together.
Exactly. It's a classic case of complementary strengths. And they actually formalized this partnership back in September of 2023 with a memorandum of cooperation.
Okay, wait, hold on. So this memorandum of cooperation, what's actually in it? What are they trying to do?
It's a pretty comprehensive agreement. It basically lays out a framework for developing like a complete EV battery supply chain.
Hmm.
So from the mining of the minerals all the way to the production of the finished batteries, there's even like targets for investment amounts, production capacity, even like technology transfer between Japanese and Canadian companies.
Wow, so this isn't just like a handshake agreement. They really put some thought into this. And this kind of leads us into Honda's multi-billion-dollar investment in Ontario. So they're potentially turning Alliston into a major North American EV hub, right?
Yeah, that's right. Honda already has some stuff going on in Alliston. They're producing hybrids there, and they have like a skilled workforce, government subsidies, access to global shipping ports. But this investment is on another level. We're talking potentially transforming Alliston into a global EV powerhouse.
Okay, but how does this fit into Honda's like overall global strategy? I mean, they're already producing EVs in other parts of the world. So what's the significance of this specific move?
Well, it's all about positioning themselves for the North American market, and specifically with like an eye on the U.S. Remember those tariffs we talked about? By producing the EVs in Canada, they can basically bypass those tariffs, and they can gain a price advantage over their competitors who are importing EVs.
So they're using Canada as a strategic springboard to target the U.S. market and potentially undercut companies like Tesla, who are still subject to the tariffs. Pretty clever.
It's a bold move, for sure.
Yeah.
It could have some pretty significant implications for the entire North American auto industry. Just imagine a scenario where you have Canadian-made EVs backed by Japanese technology.
Hmm.
Using Canadian resources, all start flooding the U.S. market at a lower price point than the competitors.
That's a pretty compelling image. But what about Tesla's reaction to all of this? Surely they're not just like sitting back and watching this all unfold.
But Tesla hasn't really publicly addressed this specific development yet, but you can bet they're paying attention. They are still the dominant player in the EV market. But this alliance is a very real challenge.
Okay, so we've got Canada making these strategic plays, partnering with Japan, attracting massive investments, and potentially shaking things up for Tesla. But there's another layer to this whole story, right? The critical minerals angle.
Oh, absolutely. Canada's abundance of these critical minerals is a key part of this whole thing. They're not just a passive supplier of these raw materials. They're leveraging these resources to attract this foreign investment
Yeah.
and really shape the future of the EV industry.
So instead of just digging stuff up and shipping it off, they're saying, hey, come build your factories here, create jobs here, and let's build this EV ecosystem together.
Exactly. It's a much more strategic approach, and it's already paying off.
But I'm curious, what's the specific appeal for a company like, say, Panasonic? Why would they choose to invest in Canada over investing in their own domestic battery production in Japan?
Well, aside from the obvious access to the critical minerals, there are a few key factors at play. Canada has a stable political environment, a well-developed infrastructure, and a highly skilled workforce. Plus, the Canadian government is really incentivizing these investments, like they're offering subsidies to companies like Panasonic to set up shop in Canada.
So it's not just about the resources themselves, it's like creating a whole ecosystem that's attractive to these global players. And speaking of incentives, I remember reading something about specific programs that the Canadian government has in place to support this EV push. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, they've got like a multi-pronged approach going on. There are direct subsidies for building these battery production facilities, tax breaks for companies investing in EV research and development, and even incentives for consumers to purchase electric vehicles. They're really going all in.
Sounds like they're taking a page out of China's playbook, using a combination of industrial policy and government support to kind of foster that domestic EV industry.
There are some parallels there for sure.
Yeah.
But Canada's approach seems to be a little bit more focused on attracting that foreign investment
Mhm.
and building those international partnerships, whereas China's strategy has been more about, developing their own domestic champions.
Yeah. Interesting distinction. Okay, so we've got this whole economic and geopolitical angle covered, but what about the environmental side of things? I mean, Canada is also ramping up its LNG exports to Japan, which seems a little at odds with this push for EVs.
It's a complex issue for sure. On one hand, you have this move towards cleaner transportation with EVs,
Hmm.
which is definitely a good thing. But then on the other hand, you have increased production of LNG, which is still a fossil fuel, although it is a bit cleaner than coal.
Yeah, so it's not a simple black and white situation. There are trade-offs and competing priorities at play.
Exactly, and it's really important to consider the nuances here. Canada's government has been very vocal about their commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they've even set some really ambitious targets for achieving net zero emissions by 2050.
Okay, but how do they reconcile those targets with this increased production and export of LNG?
Well, their argument is that LNG can serve as a bridge fuel, helping countries transition away from coal while they build out renewable energy infrastructure.
So they're basically saying, look, we're committed to a cleaner future, but we also need to be realistic about the energy needs of today.
Yeah, precisely. It's a balancing act. And it's also worth noting that the revenue generated from those LNG exports can actually be used to further fund the investments in renewable energy and EV infrastructure.
That's a good point. So it's not an either situation. It's more about finding ways to leverage those revenue streams to accelerate the transition to a cleaner energy future.
That's the idea, at least. Of course, there are critics who would argue that Canada should be focusing solely on renewable energy and phasing out fossil fuels entirely, but, that's a whole other conversation.
It is a good reminder that these issues are very rarely simple. There are always multiple perspectives and competing interests to consider. But let's bring it back to the auto industry for a second. We've talked a lot about Honda and their big bet on Canada. What about the other major players? Are they making similar moves?
We're seeing a lot of activity across the board. Volkswagen, for example, has announced plans to invest heavily in battery production in Canada. And they've even hinted at the possibility of building a new EV factory there.
So it's not just a Honda thing, it's becoming more of a trend. Canada's attracting attention from all the big names.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the North American market either. Companies are looking at Canada as a potential hub for exporting EVs to other parts of the world, especially Europe and Asia.
It really does seem like Canada is trying to position itself to become a global EV powerhouse. But what about the impact on the existing automotive landscape, particularly in places like the US and Mexico?
That's a great question. The traditional auto manufacturing hubs in the US and Mexico are definitely feeling the pressure from this shift.
And I imagine those tariffs aren't helping matters much.
Not at all. Those tariffs have created a real ripple effect throughout the entire North American auto industry. And it's not even just about the finished vehicles themselves, it's about the whole supply chain.
So it's not just about where the cars are being built, it's about where the batteries are being produced, where all the raw materials are coming from, and where the research and development is happening.
Exactly. And all those pieces are starting to shift.
Yeah.
Canada is becoming a magnet for investment in all of those areas.
Okay, so we've got this whole new landscape emerging with Canada right at the center of it.
Yeah.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of like a global push for electrification, these trade wars and all the geopolitical maneuvering. It's a lot to keep track of.
It's a complex web for sure,
Yeah.
but it's also really fascinating to watch unfold.
I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the key trends or developments that you're paying the closest attention to in this whole saga?
Well, for one, I'm really interested in seeing how this new alliance between Canada and Japan actually evolves. Will it truly become like a model for international collaboration in this EV sector? Or will it kind of face challenges and roadblocks along the way?
That's a good one. And what about the impact on the workforce? This shift to EVs is going to require a whole new set of skills and expertise. So is Canada actually prepared for that?
That's another crucial aspect. They have a strong foundation in that traditional automotive manufacturing, But they're going to need to invest heavily in retraining and upskilling their workforce to really meet the demands of this new EV-centric industry.
So there are opportunities and challenges ahead. But one thing's for sure, this is a story that's only just beginning.
And it's a story with far-reaching implications, not just for the auto industry, but for the global economy as a whole.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, from trade wars to strategic alliances and everything in between. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that we really need to examine. What about the impact on Tesla? They've been the EV frontrunner for so long, but how will this Canadian-Japanese partnership actually affect their position?
Well, it's the question on everyone's mind. Tesla has, a strong brand and a really loyal customer base and a pretty big head start in this market, but they can't just ignore these changes that are happening.
Yeah.
This new alliance poses some very real challenges.
So let's break it down a little. One of the key issues we discussed is Canada's control over those essential critical minerals. How much of a threat does this pose to Tesla's supply chain?
It's a good point, and it's definitely a point of concern. Tesla's always relied on getting those raw materials from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah.
But as Canada starts to prioritize these partnerships with companies like Panasonic,
Yeah.
it could start to really squeeze Tesla's access and potentially drive up their costs.
And it's not even just about the raw materials this partnership is building, like a whole EV ecosystem in Canada. From mining to manufacturing, doesn't that just create a whole new level of competition for Tesla?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine Honda with all of the Japanese technology and expertise producing these EVs right in North America, but potentially at a lower cost because of the government subsidies and access to efficient shipping routes. That's a direct challenge to Tesla's dominance.
And then there's the tariff issue. We've talked about how those Canadian-made EVs could enter the markets like Europe and Asia without those huge import taxes. And that would allow them to undercut Tesla's prices. So how significant of an advantage could that be?
Well, price is a huge factor for EV buyers.
Yeah.
Even a small difference in price could make a consumer choose a different brand, especially if the features and quality are the same. This is where the Honda Canada-Japan alliance could really gain an edge in those key international markets.
So Tesla's facing potential supply chain constraints, increased competition, and a price disadvantage in certain markets. What does this mean for their future? Is their EV crown at risk?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but they'll need to adapt quickly. They can't just rely on their past successes to carry them forward in this changing environment.
So what kind of adaptations are we talking about? What steps could Tesla take to stay on top?
Well, they might need to diversify their own supply chains, perhaps even explore some partnerships of their own. And they'll need to stay innovative, keep pushing the boundaries of technology and design, stay ahead of the curve.
They could even look into setting up production facilities in Canada themselves, take advantage of those government incentives and, be closer to those critical minerals.
That's definitely a possibility. It would be a smart move to kind of counteract the growing influence of this Honda Canada-Japan alliance right in their backyard.
This whole situation is like a textbook example of disruption.
Yeah.
A new player comes in with a different approach, and suddenly the established leader has to rethink their entire strategy.
And that's what makes this so interesting. We're seeing this pivotal moment in the evolution of the auto industry, and the outcome is still up in the air. It's not just about Canada and Japan. It's about the future of mobility as a whole.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be looking out for as this story continues to unfold?
I'd say keep an eye on a few key things. How Tesla responds to this new challenge, whether other automakers follow Honda's lead and invest in Canada, and how the Canadian government handles this huge surge in interest and activity in their EV sector.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the world's changing really fast, and staying informed is more important than ever. I mean, who would have thought that a trade war with the U.S. would put Canada at the forefront of the EV revolution?
It's definitely an interesting turn of events, and it shows just how connected the global economy really is. Sometimes those unexpected challenges can create the most interesting opportunities.
Well, I think we've done a good job breaking down this really complex web of information. Our deep dive into Canada's EV pivot has really revealed this story of strategic alliances,
Yeah.
economic changes, and the potential for some major shifts in the global auto industry.
And it really just emphasizes that we live in this dynamic world where you need to be adaptable and innovative to succeed.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep those articles coming. You never know what fascinating story we'll uncover next.